Before we begin today's show, I want to make a few official statements. 1. I don't want to die. I have no plans to take my own life, and if I pass away in the next couple of months, you know who did it. 2. The facts presented in the following episode can be independently verified by visiting the resources presented in the description of this podcast. And 3. All opinions presented in the Conspiracy Files are solely those of the producer and host of the show. All parties are considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And now, let's do a deep dive. Welcome back to the Conspiracy Files. Another day here in our new house. We're still moving in, getting everything set up. Kind of bright. I might record later at night. I tried to move a mattress to block some of the light out if you guys are watching this. Welcome to all the people listening to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And hello to everybody visually watching the show. It's a treat to have everybody here taking this journey with us. This is a episode that is really dark and is going to go down in the history of the Conspiracy Files as one of the darkest, most depraved, most disturbing cases we've presented so far. This is a story that haunts me at night, involving a pedophile ring, unsolved killings, corrupt officials. It's really twisted stuff. But as always, if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave me a 5-star review on whatever podcasting app you're listening on. Leave me a comment or a like on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, and yeah, you can check out the other podcasts that I co-host, Murder in America with my beautiful wife Courtney, or you can watch me ghost hunt on YouTube at the Paranormal Files. But yeah, let's just get into this story. The script is brought to you by Sabrin Chandler Lewis. The Family Murders. So we're going to start with a quote. It's peaceful. It's gentle. It's well named for a woman. It's got that feeling. End quote. A resident of Adelaide in South Australia states this quote with a friendly smile and warm tone. He's being interviewed for a 1982 promotional video of his city, just before it goes on to show beautiful tree-lined streets, bustling shops, and the kind faces of citizens. If I can arrange it, I should keep coming back here over and over and over again. An excited performer smiles wildly with an elated expression as she lavishes praise over the city, while in the background the sun shines down on urban treetops visible from the high window. Sunshine, trees, and a sea of kind faces. Within this sea, many faces that should be there are missing. These are the faces of young men and children, 5 confirmed, but over 150 suspected. In the early 80s, the state of South Australia was sent into a panic as bodies began to pile up, all found drugged, brutalized, and mutilated. Parents went into mourning, and many wondered if their sons were next. In a sea of disappearances and assaults, a ring of many suspects were identified, but only one was arrested, and he was only charged with one of these many murders. There could be up to 150 of them. These people, these monsters, formed a ring of evil in Adelaide, a supposedly peaceful and gentle city. They lured men and boys, promising safety, but only delivered misery and death. And even as these many names come to light, their connections and protections keep them safe from the consequences of their actions and from the justice they deserve. This ring of evil, known as the Family, brought terror to Adelaide in the early years of the 1980s. This title leads people to think of parents and siblings, those who should be loving and kind. But the family showed anything but love to the sons of Adelaide. Even these many years later after their demise, justice has failed to shine its light in South Australia. But who kept the darkness from being dispelled? And what other demons danced in the shadows? What monsters lurk in the streets of Adelaide? And who's allowing them, to this day, continue to roam unchecked? Chapter 1. City of Corpses. The promotional video of Adelaide in South Australia is a warm, welcoming, bright video showcasing many of the great experiences that this city has to offer. What it doesn't explain, however, is that over many decades, Adelaide has been center stage for many of Australia's most depraved and sinister crimes. It used to be known as the City of Churches, as chapels and religious centers dotted numerous street corners. The people of Adelaide were known to be notoriously reverent in worship, but when murders began to stain their city with blood, Adelaide took on a new nickname, the City of Corpses. CrimeLibrary.org says the following about how the city came to be synonymous with death. Per capita, Adelaide and its environs have recorded more of Australia's most notorious crimes than any other Australian capital city. In the annals of Australia's most horrific crimes, laid-back Adelaide's sinister past and present makes other cities look like Camelot. In a city with many lives lost at the hands of a killer, however, one case stands out, especially to me, above the rest. the family murders. The family murders began with the discovery of a body, but soon turned into a dark tidal wave with many deaths and many criminals kept safe through forced orders of silence and their own status. This whole thing started on the bank of South Para Reservoir, below the old bridge on June 24th, 1979. Weirdly enough, that's Courtney, my wife's birthday, and that's the day that Chris Benoit, the wrestler, murdered his family. And I recorded my part of that podcast this morning, so that's really strange, June 24th. But now we get to the first victim. The early and mid-70s saw Adelaide as no more or less subject to major crime than other Australian cities. But as the 80s approached, things started to pick up. South Australia was still frightened after the discovery of 5 female murder victims near Truro, when the discovery of 16-year-old Alan Barnes was made. Alan was an average kid from the city of Adelaide, known for being energetic, handsome, and in his mother's words, cheeky, which means playfully rude or bold. His mother, Judy, further recalls that he was quick-witted and always kept people laughing. Alan worked part-time, refilling vending machines, but police were concerned that Alan was beginning to dabble in hard drugs, including heroin. He had a pending rape charge open against him from a young woman, but the general consensus was that the act was consensual, and the woman he had allegedly assaulted was making an excuse for her boyfriend to avoid being caught cheating. The case would never go to court to find the truth. On the 17th of June 1979, Alan was hitchhiking home from the Cheltenham residence of Darko Castellan, whom he had recently befriended. It was a Sunday, and the two of them had planned to hitchhike to Alan's home in Salisbury. Both cities were smaller suburbs of Adelaide, but quite far apart. Darko's brother dropped off Alan and Darko at the corner of Grand Junction Road and Addison Road. Darko would soon return home, but a witness would see Alan accept a ride and get into a white Holden HQ sedan near the corner of Grand Junction Road and Production Road. The van allegedly carried 3 or 4 other people, and after he climbs into the van, Alan's never seen alive again. The next day, Monday the 18th, Alan's mother, Judy, calls the police to report her son as missing. Nothing comes from the police investigation into Alan's disappearance until exactly a week to the day after he vanished. On June 24th, 1979, 2 hikers were walking on a dirt track near the South Para Reservoir when they made a discovery that would begin this horrific saga. It was the contorted body, the dead body, of a young man. Judy was watching TV when the report came over the news. A man in his 20s had been found under the old bridge at South Para Reservoir. She was so certain that it was Alan that she called the police once again and told them it wasn't a man in his 20s, but a 16-year-old kid, and it was her son. She told them to look on the back of his watch for an engraving that proved it was the watch given to Alan as a Christmas gift. The police came to see her soon afterwards. When Judy and her husband followed them to the police station, Judy's husband and their doctor went down to the morgue and confirmed the horrible truth. The corpse indeed belonged to Alan Barnes. The post-mortem autopsy brings further horrible news, however, which showed that Alan Barnes had faced absolutely unimaginable pain before his life was ended. He had been sadistically tortured, held in an unknown location for 5 days, and then brutally murdered. Alan had been tortured, beaten, and anally raped, and died from blood loss due to massive anal injuries, likely caused by the forced insertion of a large blunt object with a tapered end, such as a bottle. Alan had Noctec in his system, a powerful sedative and hypnotic used before surgeries to calm patients. Mixed with this sedative was alcohol. The police had no leads or evidence of what had happened, but with the results of the autopsy, they put together a scenario that they believed to be accurate. Alan was picked up on the corner of Production Road and Grand Junction. He had been offered an alcoholic drink, which had been laced with these sedatives. Alan then lost consciousness and woke up in an unknown location, naked and confused by the sedative alcohol mixture. The police believe Alan was unable to move, and during the 5 days of his captivity, he was beaten and sexually assaulted by an unknown number of people. After the disturbing abuse, which led to this massive blood loss, Alan succumbed to his injuries. When it was found that he had died, Alan was then cleaned and redressed in different clothing than what he was wearing when he was abducted. The police stated that Alan had most likely died the Friday before his discovery, and then was disposed of on Saturday the 23rd at the South Para Reservoir. He had died no more than 48 hours before he was found. The police immediately launched an investigation. Many unconfirmed sightings of Alan came into the station, but only a few were considered credible. The investigation was stifled, even though they offered a reward for information and received a few tips. But they didn't have much time to focus solely on Alan. because just 2 months after his body was found, more human remains would turn up. The second victim. A pair of fishermen were fishing near Mutton Cove on the shore of the Port Adelaide River on August 28, 1979. The wharf they had chosen to fish at was remote and disused, a place people didn't often visit. The two fishermen noticed something snagged on some rocks, floating just above the water. It was a pair of 2 garbage bags. Upon closer inspection, they saw that it wasn't just trash dumped in the river. It was the mutilated parts of a human body. The heel of a man's foot was sticking out of the ripped garbage bag. Detectives were immediately called to the scene to begin an investigation, and it wasn't long before the victim was identified as Neil Frederick Muir, who had gone missing 2 days prior. Neil's body, like Alan's, had been severely mangled. He had been cut into 4 sections, just above the knee, immediately above the hips, and at the neck. His fingers had been cut off. The areas where his tattoos had been were skinned from his body, and his genitals had been severely mutilated by being sliced apart into multiple sections. A testicle was removed from his body. The head of his penis had been cut off, and the appendage had been sliced down the center. Neil's head had also been attached to the torso with a rope that went through the mouth and neck. His organs were not found with the body, and to this day, they've never been located. In their place was a bag wrapped tightly, containing the tattooed flesh that had been skinned off, as well as his fingers. Also stuffed into his chest and abdominal cavity were his lower legs. His arms were also placed within his hollow torso. It was as if the man's body had been turned into some kind of gruesome suitcase by the killer. It was so disturbing that even the police and detectives were horrified by the scene. Bags containing the body parts were taken away for further examination, and it's here where the Adelaide police realized that the evidence found in Neil Muir's case shockingly resembled the horrors inflicted upon Alan. At first, it was theorized that Neil was killed for failing to pay drug debts. Sadly, gruesome deaths were commonly associated with those who delved too deeply into the underworld of illicit substances. Neil also had drugs and alcohol in his system at the time of his death, and he too had died from massive blood loss due to an injury inflicted by a large tapered object. The 2 bodies had been dumped in or close to water, and both were last seen on a Sunday. So who was the man in the garbage bags? Neil Muir was a transient who wandered Adelaide and was suspected of being a He was known to the police as a heroin user and had disappeared on the 27th of August, 1979. Neil was known around common Adelaide night spots, such as the hotels in Hindley Street, the Duke of York Hotel, and the Buckingham Arms Hotel. The police believe that, like Alan, Neil had been drugged, tortured, and sexually assaulted, with the injuries sustained leading to his death. But unlike Alan, Neil had been dismembered, skinned in places, and then had his arms, legs, appendages, and skin stuffed inside of his hollowed out torso. The dismemberment of Neil was surgical in nature and had to have been done by someone with intense surgical knowledge. In other words, this wasn't like someone just took a hacksaw and cut this guy's body apart. These were clean, precise cuts that when investigators looked at them, they could tell were done by someone who was trained with surgical skills. This revelation, on top of Alan's death, rocked Adelaide at its foundation. People began to fear who was next. It was no longer an isolated case. It was a serial killing. Among the people of Adelaide, a killer or multiple killers walked the streets, but there were no clues pointing to who they were. Then a call came into the police station that offered a lead. An anonymous caller gave the name of a local accountant, a man named Bevan von Einem. According to this anonymous caller, Bevan was responsible for Alan's death. And if this man killed Alan, he may have killed Neil as well. Now, while this information may have seemed promising at first, it was simply filed away with the rest of the leads that the police received. Even with hundreds of leads, the case seemed to be going nowhere. It was as if no one in the entire city of Adelaide had any clue who had done such a horrible thing to these 2 young men. That, or someone did know, and they were keeping their mouths shut. 2 years passed as the case gained a little traction. Alan and Neil were laid to rest, and the city began to forget about their deaths. But as with most serial killers, it wouldn't end until someone was caught. And now we get to the 3rd victim, or who possibly could be the 4th. Mark Langley was 18 in 1982, attending a birthday party at Windsor Gardens. It was Sunday, February the 28th at 1:15 a.m. when Mark and his friends left the party, climbing into a Datsun 1600 and driving into the city, where they parked on War Memorial Drive near the River Torrens. Mark got into a fight with his friends, so he got out of the car and walked along the north side of the road. Mark's friends then left, but would later return to try and pick him up. However, Mark was nowhere to be seen. They assumed he had hitchhiked home and returned back to their houses. David Langley, Mark's father, waited for his son to come home later that morning. At 9 a.m., when there still was no sign of his kid, he began to worry, and at noon, he called the police. As the next few days came and went, police began an intense investigation. The thoughts of the other missing boys still hadn't come to the front of their minds though, and they were treating this as a one-off disappearance. The police first interviewed those who last saw Mark and hunted the city for any sign of him, even recruiting divers to search the River Torrens. Yet, no one could find any trace of where he had been. But his family still hoped for the best, as days went by with no news. They hoped he was simply injured, lost, but most importantly, still alive. But these hopes were shattered 9 days later, when Mark's body was located on the 8th of March 1982, along a road in the scrubland of Summertown, east of Adelaide. Items he had been wearing when he was last seen were missing from the body, such as his blue shirt and silver chain necklace. There were no bloodstains on his clothes. In fact, they were clean. He bore no visible injuries, and yet Mark was dead. The police contacted Mark's father and gave him the news. David's son wouldn't be coming home. And after Mark's body was taken in for post-mortem, it was discovered that he too had drugs in his system and had died from a massive anal wound and blood loss. But there was something about Mark's corpse that was different than the others. It appeared that the killer had performed some kind of a crude surgery. Unlike the mutilation done to Neil, there had been a vertical cut into his abdomen from the navel to the area of his pubic hair, which had been stitched up. The hair in the area had been shaved as if he had been at a hospital. And when Mark was reopened, it was found that sections of his small bowel were missing. The police theorized that the murderer had to open the bowels to retrieve damning evidence from inside of his body, to keep their own identity a secret. They further theorized that the items in the small intestine had been anally inserted and were partially responsible for the anal injuries that Mark had sustained. David Langley, Mark's father, was horrified. Mark had been average, a kid who liked cars and girls. He couldn't imagine why anyone would have done something like this to him, or that a human being could have done this in the first place. He stated the following to Crime Investigation Australia years later, quote, "Animals would not do this. All these years, I've been trying to think of what to call them. You do not call them men. You do not call them people. You do not call them animals. What do you call them? And for 25 years, I could not think of the name to call them. To address the press. What do I say to them? What do we call these people? They're not human." End quote. But how had Mark come to have met this horrific fate? Because of his relation to the other murder victims, the investigators deduced what they could. The police concluded that after Mark got out of the car with his friends, he had accepted a ride from a stranger, trying to hitchhike home. When he got into the car, he had been given a beer laced with a sedative. After he woke up, he was held captive and tortured for several days while being force-fed alcohol and drugs. It was at this point that the police decided, certainly, the same killer committed all 3 murders. Throughout the investigation, Bevan von Einam's name continued to pop up, but he was only one of the many people of interest. It had seemed that the killer had taken a hiatus between the killings. You see, Alan and Neil were killed in 1979, and Mark Langley was killed in 1982. Because the police were so certain that these killings were related to other victims, the police opened up the case files of other missing boys and even missing men. One of these files was on Peter Stff, who had gone missing many months prior, the 3rd victim. The police had already feared the worst for many of these missing boys, but they wouldn't know how right they were until June of 1982. In May of 1982, the Adelaide police were about to receive another call and another body. About 31 miles north of Adelaide lay 2 wells, a city suburb. A local farmer had gone to the area adjacent to Middle Beach Road to clear the land. After bulldozing bushes and box thorns, he left, but came back on May 20th to burn away the debris. The debris burned for 2 days, and it was a month later that the farmer would return to the area and continue his efforts. But he would find more than he bargained for. June 22nd, 1982, saw the farmer working through the ashes and leftover brush when he spotted a human skull. He then returned home, and the next morning, the police were called. Not long after, the body was identified as belonging to Peter Stff, who had been missing for over 10 months. Peter was a talented boy with a love for music. He lived with his parents in Adelaide's northern suburbs, an average happy kid in the emerging 80s. It had been the 27th of August 1981 when Peter left home without his backpack, planning to skip school to hang out with his cousin at the Rundle Mall. Plans changed, however, when he learned that his cousin couldn't make the trip. Peter went into the city anyways, but between home and the mall, he mysteriously vanished. When he didn't come home that evening, his parents immediately reported him as missing. As soon as the call came in, the police began investigating reports of his disappearance. One report stated he never got into the city in the first place and was abducted at the Tea Tree Plaza, still close to his home. This tip further indicated that Peter had been seen with a male at the time of his disappearance. Even after a plea from police for more information, calling the public to action, no one in the public offered any tips. They had no leads, and Peter's name went into the files as one of Adelaide's many forgotten missing boys. This was until his body was discovered in the bush burning at 2 wells. Dental records from the skeletal remains led the police to believe it was indeed 14-year-old Peter, and it was confirmed not long afterwards. Peter's family was in true shock. They couldn't believe their young boy had been killed. He had no enemies, in his mother's words. He didn't do anything to anyone. His family, according to Crime Investigation Australia, still doesn't believe that the remains belong to their young son. His mother, for many years, waited every minute for Peter to walk back through the front door to their home. A post-mortem was conducted on the remains, and evidence began to mount that Peter had been the true third victim of the serial killer responsible for Alan and Neil's deaths, making Mark the fourth victim, not the third. The mutilation done to Peter seemed to be similar to what was done to Neil. His back had been cut through with a saw, and his legs had been cut through at the knees as well. Peter, just like Neil, had been cut into pieces. After the discovery of Peter, the investigation went into overdrive. After 4 victims, there was more than enough reason to believe the killer would keep going until they were caught. The public was highly anxious knowing that someone in their city was hunting their sons. But time began to pass, and the police were no closer to finding the monster who had committed these crimes. In 1983, it had been many months since the last body was discovered, and thoughts of the killer slowly began to fade from the forefront of the public's minds. It seemed as though, against all reason, the killer had stopped, at least for now. But then, in July, the murders took headlines by storm once again. The 5th victim. Richard Kelvin was 15 years old in June of 1983. He had a passion for sports, was considered good-looking, and had a steady girlfriend. He lived with his parents, Betty and Rob, in one of Adelaide's fashionable northern neighborhoods. Richard's father was a popular presenter on the Channel 9 News, and many knew of him and his family. So this was a pretty famous family. Richard's dad was on TV almost every single day talking to Adelaide from the studio. So people knew Richard, they knew Richard's family, and this is definitely going to be a turning point here. It was the 5th of June, a Sunday, when this normal family was met with a tragic event. Richard had gone to the park with a friend to play football. The clothing he was wearing, jeans, sneakers, and a Channel 9 t-shirt, were average. One article stands out, however. As a joke, Richard had taken the studded collar from his family dog and was wearing it around his neck. So he had a very distinctive article or item of clothing on. As the sky that evening began to grow dark, Richard and his friend began walking home and stopped at O'Connell Street's bus stop. This is where the 2 boys parted ways and where the end begins for Richard Kelvin. It was only a bit over 1,000 feet between Richard's home on Ward Street and the area where the 2 boys parted ways. And this is where Richard vanished, never to be seen alive again. 1,000 feet from his home, he vanishes into thin air. And when Richard didn't come home that evening, his parents immediately called the police to report him missing. The police knew it was serious as they recalled the deaths of the other 4 male victims and began knocking on doors around the neighborhood to see if anyone had information that could help them find Richard alive. The detectives spoke with the parents, Rob and Betty, but the most valuable information came from a nearby security guard. The guard stated that around the time of the disappearance, about 6:15 p.m., he heard cries for help and car doors slamming. However, more information came than that. There were multiple raised voices, meaning more than one person had been involved in Richard's kidnapping. The car that Richard had been abducted in was noted to have a loud exhaust, but the car wasn't able to be identified. Still, the police had more information in this disappearance than in any of the other cases. The other neighbors corroborated the story further that the men's voices and the voice of a woman were heard shouting as Richard Kelvin was abducted. Finally, the stories of the young men of Adelaide began to make larger news. Newscasters were important and prominent people in their communities back then, and for the son of a newscaster to be stolen was seemingly more worthy of spreading the word. Floods of tips and theories on Richard's disappearance flooded into the police station. It was already considered that Richard had fallen prey to the murderer of Alan, Neil, Mark, and Peter, and everyone wanted to find him before the worst could take place. People walked the streets searching everywhere and even visited fortune tellers to try and get a clue of what had happened to one of the most prominent sons in Adelaide. But weeks pass and detectives fear for the worst for Richard. The police are stretched thin, investigating every lead available, yet nothing comes of their work for several weeks when the worst is confirmed. The Holmes family, led by their father Trevor, are searching for moss-covered rocks for a garden in Mount Crawford, north of the city of Adelaide. In the July winter, they didn't have much luck finding rocks, but they did have luck in finding the boy all of Adelaide had been searching for. Trevor had wandered into the scrublands as he looked for the rocks and noticed some kangaroo bones lying in the dirt. As he bends down to inspect them, he sees a person lying on the ground not far away. He at first believed that the person was injured, so he stepped closer. He called out to the injured person lying on the ground, asking if they were okay. But as he pulls back the bushes, he notices his head. The hair is greasy and the skin is mottled. He pulls the bushes away further as he tries to call out again and sees the Channel 9 shirt. It was Richard Kelvin, and he was dead. Trevor immediately calls the police and they arrive to inspect the body. Richard was wearing the same clothing that he had on when he was vanished, and that dog collar was still around his neck. A crime scene was then established, and the police began searching for more evidence. The body of Richard Kelvin was lying near a dirt airstrip at Kersbrook, lying in a fetal position. The police determined that the body had been there for at least 2 weeks. The body was then taken away, and an autopsy was performed. Richard had died in the same manner as the rest of the victims. Yet Richard was held alive for at least 5 weeks. The toxicology screen noted the drugs Mandrax, which had been in the system of some of the other victims, and which had been present in the previous bodies as well. Mandrax is another sedative, like but Mandrax was particularly popular in the disco scene of the day. In other words, it was a party drug. There were traces of 4 different drugs in Richard's system, but these were not the cause of death. Like the other men, Richard had been killed by the forced insertion of a large, blunt, tapered object, like a bottle. While the drugs force-fed to the 15-year-old were stupefying, they would not have eliminated the pain that he felt in his final hours. Not for Richard, and not for any of the other victims. After Richard had succumbed to his ordeal, his body was washed clean of fingerprints and other evidence, dressed back in his own clothes, and dumped in the bushlands outside of Adelaide. No one wanted to believe these horrific crimes had been committed in their city. It was monstrous, and yet it was in Adelaide. Then, after Richard Kelvin is found and an autopsy is performed, the newspapers began to speculate on the killer at last. Throughout the investigation, little pieces of evidence had been coming in. Journalists and police had been working to piece the clues together, and they finally had a few concrete ideas. The murder of the 5 Adelaide victims hadn't been committed by one serial killer, but rather a group of them. The group, furthermore, was not simply a gathering of deranged sadists hiding behind mild-mannered lives. They were high-profile officials, businessmen, and even judges, all of whom believed they were beyond the law. After this point, the murderers came to be known as the Family, after a detective referred to the group as one big happy family. The name stuck, used as a hook by the media, and since then has haunted the people of Adelaide. The investigation. One of these suspects that first came to be synonymous with the family was the man whose name continued to pop up in the investigation numerous times, Bevan Spencer von Einem. An associate of Bevan's came to police early in the investigation. He was nicknamed Mr. B, and his true name has never been revealed even to this day. And what Mr. B had to say was shocking. This man, a mild-mannered accountant during the day, was actually a killer. And with the help of his associates, he had murdered the 5 boys and assaulted many more. This tip led to a long investigation on von Einem, where it was found that he had been implicated in several sexual assaults in the area, but he was never criminally charged with any. Von Einem was a man with a troubled past himself. He grew up poor and faced sexual abuse as a child, and at the time of the investigation, he had been living with his mother in the northern suburb of Paradise, and he was said to be polite. People who had interacted with him had good things to say, but this cover would soon be blown. You see, the police, using a database that can track what prescriptions are given and to whom, found that von Einem had a prescription for Xanax, the prescription sedative common in the disco scene, and the same drug found in several of the boys' bodies. The police then took von Einem to the police station where they would conduct their questioning. When Einem was interviewed, he showed a certain suspicious demeanor, which to the police set him high on their suspect list. The strangest part of the interview with von Einem, according to police, is that when he was asked how he would commit a murder, he replied that he wouldn't, because it was, quote, unethical to kill, end quote. He said that he used the man to help him sleep, but he used no other drugs. When the police brought out a bottle of Einem became incredibly nervous. He said he had the flu when Kelvin was kidnapped, but consented to DNA collection and a search of his home. Afterward, von Einem fled the country for a vacation to the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. The police would go on to search his home, and in his closet, they found a hidden ledge where they found Valium, and all of which were prescribed to him. These drugs had all been found in Richard Kelvin's toxicology report. After this discovery, they found fibers from Bevan's bedroom that had also been present on the young boy. Von Einem liked to dye his hair jet black. He had a regular hairdresser he visited, and one of his black hairs was found on the corpse of Richard Kelvin. Now, the police remembered the man who had given the tip about von Einem in the first place, Mr. B. Using the information that Mr. B had given them, they tracked him down and asked for everything he knew. Mr. B claimed that he was present for the rapes of the young men and boys, but never present for their murders, though he did know that Bevan had committed them. He told the police that von Einem would often cruise around in his car looking to pick up young men, but that he didn't cruise alone. Von Einem would lure the young boys and young men into his car, saying they were headed to a party where there would be alcohol and girls. Mr. B said that usually von Einem would have other people in the car with him, all co-conspirators, to make the story about this party more believable. However, once in the car, the victims would be given a beer laced with drugs, causing them to lose consciousness. After, they would be taken to one of several locations to be assaulted and sometimes murdered. And Mr. B wasn't the only one who had said this before. Another young man had come forward with a similar story. This man said he had been picked up in a car driven by a man, drugged, taken to a house, and had been assaulted by multiple men. Mr. B also gave many names of people who were associated with von Einem, and even though the police questioned them, there wasn't enough evidence to charge any with a crime. But von Einem didn't get off so easily. Due to the evidence at hand, he was arrested and tried for the murder of Richard Kelvin on November 3rd, 1983, when he returned to the country. On February 20th, 1984, the committal hearing began in order to decide if there was enough evidence to take the case to court. Von Einem had originally said that he was sick with the flu on the night of the abduction, but faced with mounting evidence, he admitted that the boy had been with him. He stated that Richard and he had been in contact on the 5th of June, 1983, and that he had been driving down O'Connell Street, where Richard had been walking. Von Einem said he was merely there to park, and then find a place to get fish and chips for dinner. He stated that, while trying to find parking on a side street, he had almost run over Richard, who was jogging straight at the car. The two had begun to talk, and Einem stated to the court that he believed Richard had bisexual tendencies, and they spoke about Richard's problems at school. According to Einem, Kelvin willingly got into the car, contradicting the raised voices and cries for help that multiple witnesses had heard. They then drove to von Einem's home, and Bevan stated that the two had sat on his bed. In this way, he was attempting to explain the bed fibers on Richard's clothing. According to von Einem, the two sat and played the golden harp that Einem kept in his room. The police did see this harp when they seized Einem's drug supply, but this didn't seem to explain the fibers from Einem's cardigan. To answer that, Einem said he had hugged Richard to console him after the boy had become upset talking about the bullying he had been experiencing at school. Einem said that Richard was there for 2 hours, and afterward, he had dropped him off at Royal Adelaide Hospital, giving him $20 for some cab fare. The story seemed incredibly detailed, but it didn't fit. Einem had contradicted his earlier statement about being sick with the flu, and the amount of fibers on Kelvin's body was too great for him to have only been there for 2 hours. The court just didn't buy it. The judge, Magistrate Nick Manos, ordered Einem to stand trial for his crimes on the 25th of May, 1984. On October 15th of the same year, von Einem faced a jury of 12 of his peers and pled not guilty. He was represented by Barry Jennings and Helena Jasinski, who had been his solicitor since the murder investigation began. Solicitor is what they call an attorney in other countries other than America. On November 5th, 1984, after mountains of evidence against him was admitted into court, von Einem was found guilty of the murder of Richard Kelvin, which automatically sentenced him to life in prison. He had a non-parole period of 24 years, and likely he'll never be released. Yet, he wasn't charged with any of the other killings. There were many similarities between the murder of Richard Kelvin and the murders of the other victims, yet Einem didn't stand accused of any of them. This wouldn't be allowed to stand for long. The murders were always considered to be committed by the same person, and the police were certain of this fact. You see, the deaths of Alan Barnes and Mark Langley were especially similar. And so, 4 years after the murder conviction, an inquest was ordered into the deaths of the other 4 young men in 1988. Now let's talk about the detectives and take a closer look. So, because of the nature of the crimes committed against the victims, especially the anal injuries, the crime had always been considered to be sexual in nature. The police, throughout the investigation, had suspected that Bevan was responsible for the deaths of all 5 of the victims. And using the similarity between the cases, they brought Bevan up on charges of killing both Alan Barnes and Mark Langley. But they couldn't yet make the killings of Neil and Peter stick. In the May of 1990, Bevan was ordered to stand trial for 2 more murders. Bevan was tried by Justice Kelvin Duggan that same year. However, he found the similarity evidence, as it was called, was inadmissible. He couldn't be charged simply because the cases were so similar. They attempted to use the evidence supplied by Mr. B, yet the justice ruled that the defense could question Mr. B on his testimony as well. This turned out to be a huge blow for the defense, as the South Australia Attorney General advised that the prosecution drop the charges for Mark Langley's murder. Mr. B's story apparently couldn't stand up to scrutiny. He had given the wrong date for the Alan Barnes kidnapping, and therefore his testimony was thrown out. Despite the rest of his story being incredibly accurate and detailed, that one slip caused the entire case to crumble. Then, shortly afterwards, the prosecution faced further issues, finding associates of von Einem who would corroborate the evidence against him now that Mr. B was considered an unreliable witness. After more advice from the South Australia Attorney General, the prosecution entered a nolle prosequi, or abandonment, for the murder charge of Alan Barnes. It appeared that powerful people didn't want the matter looked further into. Alan, Mark, Neil, Peter, and Richard had all died under very similar circumstances. Yet, after roadblocks and only one willing witness, the charges began to fall apart left and right. Bevan von Einem was allowed to escape with only 1 murder conviction, but it was clear that he had a hand in every murder. Now, Mr. B, that unnamed witness, had stated that Bevan had his eye on Alan for some time, and that he had been in the car with Bevan when he coaxed Alan into his vehicle with promises of going to a party. He further stated that he had watched Bevan kidnap, drug, and rape several young men. But a hole in his story had been found by the defense, all amounting to a changed date in his testimony, and Bevan was allowed to go free from the charges. But Bevan wasn't the only killer who didn't face justice. Mr. B implicated others in his testimony who were also let free, such as Mr. R, otherwise known as the businessman. So keep in mind, these young men we've talked about, were 15, 17, younger than that. So these men are running a pedophile ring, a murderous pedophile ring. And it's clear at this point that the government is putting their hand in here and saying, don't look into this. They're shutting down these charges. I mean, what's the reasoning? This guy is providing incredibly detailed testimony that could actually bust this thing wide open. And yet he gets a date wrong, which is very easy to do. Sometimes I forget people's birthdays, my family members' birthdays. It's very easy to confuse dates. I'm sure you guys know. And with this one confused date, the whole case crumbles. Then you got the people inserting themselves, top cops in the state, coming in and saying, drop these charges. And now we get into Bevan and the businessman. Bevan had a close relationship with a man known only as the businessman. Because of suppression orders conveniently placed on the case, many of the names of the suspects have never been made public. This includes Mr. B and this accused killer rapist, the businessman. So Bevan attended many parties at the house owned by the businessman. And often, he was accompanied by non-consenting young males, minors, who were usually either semi-conscious or not conscious at all. The group that Bevan participated in at the businessman's home had allegedly been going on for many years, since 1971, after a failed abduction attempt on a young teenage boy. The boy had escaped and reported the incident to local police, and it became one of the many assault cases opened against Bevan that seemed to go nowhere. As the years went on, Bevan apparently turned to even darker roots, murdering his victims and dumping the bodies. Mr. B, that witness, had implicated the businessman and many other co-conspirators, and yet none of them ever faced a single criminal charge or were even investigated. They were interviewed, however, and their positions offer insight as to why they escaped freely. Among the crowd of suspects were 7 legal professionals, 2 politicians that a lot of people would have known if their names had been released, a doctor, and a well-known drug dealer. The businessman, 2 more doctors, and a hairdresser were also implicated and interviewed, yet no one on this massive list was ever charged. Dr. Peter Millhouse. One of the doctors who's known to be implicated is a man named Dr. Peter Millhouse. He was a gay man in Adelaide who often preyed on young men. Allegedly, Dr. Millhouse paid young male prostitutes with drugs in exchange for sexual favors. Dr. Peter Millhouse had allegedly been in a relationship with Neil Muir before his death. However, this relationship was more based on mutual advantage than attraction. As Millhouse was a doctor, he could get prescription drugs, including methadone, for his quote-unquote lover. You see, Neil was a heroin addict and often used methadone to make the come down of heroin an easier experience. Dr. Millhouse allegedly provided many drugs for Neil, but as his addiction worsened, Millhouse became tired of the young man he was taking advantage of, and the relationship deteriorated. Millhouse was said to be the last person confirmed to be in Neil's company before his disappearance, and so he became a suspect in his death. But more than that, the way that Neil's body was discovered left many clues. The body had been mutilated, certainly, but it had been done by someone with surgical skills and anatomical knowledge. The body had been cut apart in ways that spoke to a man with high education and practice with surgical tools. Because of these facts, Dr. Millhouse was brought up on charges of committing the murder. However, due to a lack of evidence, he was acquitted of the crime. Dr. Millhouse had insisted that he wasn't capable of coping with even the smallest surgery, and much of the evidence against him was deemed speculative. But Adelaide, to this day, is unconvinced. When Peter Millhouse died in 2015, the Sydney Morning Herald posted an online obituary. Among the kind messages left by family and friends, 2 comments stand out, reading, "Hope he suffered just like his victims did in the family murders in Adelaide. He is now in hell." And the next in all caps, "Murderer." Obviously, Adelaide did not all have love for the doctor. Neither did they have love for Von Einem. Dr. Millhouse shared another rather large similarity with the convicted killer: drug dealing. At the time of Neil's death, he was also not only associated with Millhouse, the doctor, but he was associated with Von Einem as well, through a woman named Sarah Novak. Bevan Von Einem was well known for being able to get drugs, and with this tactic, he recruited many participants for his schemes. Some of these names that come up in these schemes are Sarah Novak, Louis Turter, Prue Furman, and a man known only as PJ. You see, Bevan Von Einem recruited many people to help him, but the most common names brought up are the names of drag queens and transgender women, whom he used to lure men into his car before they could be drugged and taken to a secondary location where the torture would begin. Sarah Novak had known Bevan Von Einem since she was 15 years old and knew both him and victim Neil Muir. Bevan allegedly had a sexual relationship with Neil 4 years before his murder. Keep in mind, he was a teenager. This would make Bevan a pedophile. And the two had stayed close, most likely because Bevan could procure drugs to fuel Neil's addiction. Sarah benefited from Bevan in a similar way. She was a Max addict, one of the very prescription drugs that was recovered from Bevan's closet. Using this tool, Bevan manipulated Sarah into luring young men for him to fulfill his sick desires. And Sarah wasn't alone in this act. She was joined by Prue Furman, another transgender woman who was used by Einem to lure young men and boys. Prue was not manipulated through drugs, however. She actually took part in the rapes. Another victim came forward in between the murders of Mark Langley and Richard Kelvin to prove this fact. You see, Bevan had used the same tactic as with the other victims, luring in a 16-year-old named George with the promise of drugs, girls, and partying. George was taken to the secondary location, and Prue raped the boy before he blacked out. Bevan raped the boy as well, but allowed him to go free when he awoke. The boy reported it to the police, and Prue was brought up on rape charges. However, the case fell through, as like every other case in this story. According to the justice system, it couldn't be proven that the sex wasn't consensual, nor that Prue didn't know George was underage. Now that's insane. Think about that. So a pedophile can't be held accountable for raping a young victim because apparently you can't prove that the was not consensual, and you can't prove that the pedophile didn't know that the kid was underage. I'd like to see that stand up in court, not only here in America, but just anywhere in the world today. I feel like we've gone far beyond that mentality. Another name in this group is PJ, who was allegedly a victim of the group at first, who later became their friend. PJ wasn't transgender, but dressed as a woman to help Bevan lure young men. There are allegedly more women who helped Von Einem, as well as drag queens, but one name became especially important in later years. Louis Turner happened to be the man who owned the secondary location, a house where he lived with Prue Furman and other transgender women. Louis Turner was a teenager when he met Bevan Von Einem in the 60s, long before sexual contact between two men was legal in the state. However, this wasn't a bond based on mutual understanding. It was a bond shared in mutual monstrosity, as both found the act of drugging and raping young boys to be appealing. As time passed, Bevan began to use Louis Turner's residence as a place to bring his victims, under the agreement that after Bevan had finished raping them, Louis would have his term and could rape them as many times as he liked. Louis was one of the drag queens that Einem used to lure young men, going by the name of Lena when he was in character. According to Mr. B, both he and the businessman would accompany Bevan to the residence to enact their crimes against the boys of Adelaide. But later interviews didn't see Louis, the property owner, being so honest. He admitted that he had sex with the victims, but only 2 of them. When asked in an interview what had happened to the boys that Bevan would bring to his shared home, he stated, "All I know, they came, he dropped them off at our place, he went home, we let them sleep it off, they left in the morning." That's what he said. The interview was conducted for the Foxtel podcast and television show Frozen Lies. It aims to get the word out about the murders, as well as lift the suppression orders on many of the names involved in the case. One of these names, which had been formally suppressed, was Prue Furman. Louis Turner was reluctant to divulge all he knew. Perhaps he believed he would be in danger if he revealed his secrets. But secrets would eventually come out many years after the murders took place. In all, this group has been suspected of kidnapping, drugging, and raping over 150 young men and boys. It cannot be said how many truly fell victim to Von Einem, nor can it be said how many more fell victim to the larger collection of the family. The family's members, as I said before, went far beyond Bevan Von Einem and his small group. This group included many high-profile people who, over the years, have managed to avoid justice even after committing serious crimes. A few of these high-profile members who are all but confirmed are Dr. Stephen Woodards and Robert Cowan, magistrate or judge Richard Brown, as well as businessman and boxing promoter Don Storen. In March of 2008, a cold case review was opened on the family murders case. The reward for information over the years had gradually increased in amount, with a peak of a reward amount being over $1 million. The reward also carried an immunity offer for accomplices, depending on how involved they were in the crimes. One of the suspects that the police implicated was Dr. Stephen George Woodards. He specialized in physiotherapy, yet the police believe that he may have been responsible for the surgery performed on Mark Langley. He had a reputation for helping drunk young men get home from bars, but instead of truly helping them, he drugged them and raped them. As if to prove this, in 2011, Woodards was charged with 5 counts of rape, yet none of these charges stuck, and he was allowed to walk free. At the time of the murders, he was the lover of a magistrate in the city, Richard Dutton Brown. Brown, a magistrate or judge, was also implicated in the family murders. He was allegedly close to one of Einem's social circles, one of these pedophile rape murder circles that included the businessman, Von Einem's hairdresser, and others. Magistrate Brown was accused of rape in 2006, but the charges, conveniently, were once again dropped, just like every other goddamn charge in this story. It's infuriating. Magistrate Brown and the Dr. Woodards had both been investigated for sexual offenses against children between 1977 and 1981, then investigated by Adelaide's Major Crimes Unit for having sex with underage prostitutes in 1989. But those investigations had also gone nowhere. So you got these men that are charged in the 2000s, the 2010s with raping young men. Then you have evidence that they were investigated in the 1970s, the 1980s for having sex with young boys, and nothing came out of it. I mean, what the fuck is going on here? The boxing promoter and the named businessman is Don Storen, outed as a suspect in 2008 after the cold case review was opened. This businessman differs from the one who remains unnamed due to suppression orders, which have mostly yet to be lifted. So Storen, this boxing promoter's involvement is unclear, yet he was jailed in 2006 for sexual offenses against boys aged 13 to 15. It's like so many of these cases, these men are charged with raping children and being a part of this robotic machine of rape and murder, and in this case, torture, mutilation. They might have been filming all this and selling it or passing it around their sick little circle. And they all say, oh, I had nothing to do with it. And yet, all the circumstantial evidence shows they probably did do it, like those last two guys we talked about, being accused of raping minors multiple times. Then you have this guy who was also accused of being involved in the family, never officially connected, yet in 2006, decades after the murders, he's found guilty of raping children. I think they should be looked at a little more seriously. The other doctor that was implicated in von Einem's crimes was Dr. Robert Cowan, who is known in the gay community of Adelaide for dressing frequently as a woman. Dr. Robert Cowan, or Bob Cowan, was one of the main sources of von Einem's sedative prescriptions. And out of the 135 prescriptions that von Einem had received, 112 of them had came from Bob Cowan. Bob also supplied medical certificates when von Einem missed work. The police believed that Cowan and Einem had a relationship beyond that of a doctor and patient. All the suspects involved were brought in for DNA testing before the cold case review that began in 2008, but none of these key suspects faced any charges. So let's say that doctor supplied, well, he did. He supplied von Einem with these drugs. Now let's say von Einem drugged all of his victims with these prescriptions, which he did. The doctor should be charged. Just like Mac Miller's drug dealer was charged, Michael Jackson's doctor was charged, this guy should be charged. And he was probably in on it. And keep in mind, all this stuff came out about all of these men, this evidence that these men had been investigated in the past for pedophile crimes, that they were all in documents and through witnesses named as suspects, and nothing ever happened. And now we get into some later revelations. So it seems to the average viewer as if purposeful roadblocks or perhaps blinders have been put on the investigation into these crimes committed by suspected family members. But in 2015, the diaries of yet another Einem associate promised a new lead. Trevor Peters moved in the same social circles as von Einem and lived near two of the other accomplices, Prue Furman, that transgender rapist, and Sarah Novak, the victim-turned-accomplice. Trevor's brother was clearing out his residence after he died when he discovered diaries. In these diary entries, Trevor detailed the abductions and murders of the victims committed by von Einem and his other associates. He also implicated Dr. Stephen Woodards, saying that he gave von Einem many of the tablets that he would go on to use in the murders. He further stated in these diary entries, keep in mind, he wasn't trying to publish these diary entries, he wasn't trying to go public with them. His family member found these diaries after he died, so he wasn't seeking any sort of a fame. Like, this is just his legit truth, stuff that he knew. He further stated that not only did Bevan von Einem rip the drugged hitchhikers he would pick up, but that Sarah Novak would rape these hitchhikers as well. He also implicated another name, however, that has always been suspected, a man named Dennis St. Dennis, Bevan's hairdresser, who often dyed his hair black for him. In the diary, Trevor allegedly wrote the following: both Dennis and Bevan lived with the mothers and needed a place to take the young men for sex or trade. That's in all caps and quotations. Especially, quote, rough trade, end quote, as Dennis had told me on the day that he drove me past the unit. Dennis said that they kept it secret from their families that they rented the unit, end quote. So that's from his diary. And Trevor's basically saying that Dennis, the hairdresser, and Bevan von Einem lived and had this secret unit that they rented, and this is where they took the young boys for their pedophile parties and parties, and that there was a trade going on there, and even a rough trade. And in this entry, he's talking about an apartment that was shared by Dennis, the hairdresser, Bevan von Einem, and possibly the businessman, whose identity is still hidden. The most shocking revelation he gave, however, were the photos of Alan Barnes. So in the early part of June 1979, Trevor had been at St. Dennis's hair salon. While St. Dennis, the suspect, worked on his hair, Bevan von Einem came into the salon and looked very happy. He looked at Dennis knowingly, and they both seemed suddenly to become excited. Dennis then hurried through the rest of the haircut and followed Bevan von Einem through a curtain. Then, a few moments later, Dennis and Bevan began to giggle the words, "Ooh, how evil. Ooh, it's evil." Apparently, Dennis said this many times, and Trevor went back to see what was so interesting, as he felt kind of left out. His hairdresser had just walked out on him after the haircut, and the two were now giggling behind a door. It's very strange. He found the two huddled over a table just behind the curtain, and he saw many photographs that were laying on the table, around 5 or 6 pictures. In the photos, a young blonde man was lying on his side in the front seat of a car, with his legs bent towards the steering wheel. He was naked, and a large object had been inserted into his anus. Trevor was shocked at the graphic photos, and when he asked Bevan who it was, Bevan replied, "Oh, just some hitchhiker." And as if this wasn't sickening enough, keep in mind Trevor was a minor at the time, time passed and Dennis wasn't long for the world. Dennis would soon die, and in his bed at Calvary Hospital, Dennis told him that Bevan had shown him numerous naked photographs of young men, many with objects inserted into their asses. Trevor, in his diary, stated that Dennis threatened him afterwards. He said that if he knew what was good for him, he would keep his mouth shut. Trevor also revealed much about Louis Turner in his diaries. He knew more than he divulged in his interview, according to the entries. In these entries, he wrote the following about a conversation with Prue Furman. Quote, "Louis Turner would always have a back room ready for him and Bevan, ready to abuse sexually the boys that Bevan brought there. She said that Louis Turner would always have the bed made and candles ready. She said that Mr. R was there to meet Bevan frequently. When I questioned frequently, she said yes all the time. He was there lots and lots of times," end quote. In all, the sickening acts of Bevan involved many players. It's apparently there were rooms ready for these rapes, murders, and mutilations to occur at all times, and these rapes and mutilations and murders were apparently being photographed. That's what Trevor's writing about in this journal, that there's photos of these young boys, child pornography photos with things stuck into their assholes. And these photos were being circulated from pedophile to pedophile. I don't know how big the reach was on all of this, but as always, when you get into these power players, these power brokers, these magistrates, politicians, celebrities, people that are involved in this shit, they want this shit and they increasingly want shit that's darker. And to me, it almost seems like all these men wanted to rape and murder children, and that's why they were doing it together. In all, the sickening acts of Bevan involved so many different players, so many different people. So what stopped the police from learning of their activities years before? Well, keep in mind that Bevan von Einem is still the only man imprisoned for the crimes against the Adelaide murder victims. Yet it seems through Trevor's writings and Mr. B's testimonies that the evidence should really be plentiful. Yet, after so many years, no more arrests have been made and no one has been jailed. The ring of the family, however, has been speculated to be much larger than Bevan and his close circle. You see, Bevan's circle already involved magistrates or judges and prominent doctors in the city, but something worse was suspected than these few. You see, a book named The Family Murders Dissected took a look into a similar case, The Body in the Freezer, where a prominent Adelaide lawyer was found shot and stuffed into his own refrigeration unit. Through the lawyer's connections, which included Bevan von Einem himself, the reality of the pedophile and murder ring in Adelaide could be much worse than imagined. So Bevan von Einem wasn't alone. He was said to have many co-conspirators and many more friends who all moved in the same circles. In the 70s and 80s, social circles for gay men such as bars, bookstores, and similar hangouts were emerging in society. And for the family, this was not a way to express their sexual identity with others, but a way to devise and meet up with others who wanted to commit horrible crimes. Bevan von Einem met many of his conspirators at a small Adelaide bookshop in 1960, where they were importing hardcore homosexual pornographic magazines and films from Europe. Apparently, this group was comprised of 2 journalists, 2 legal officials, and a young lawyer by the name of Darren Stevenson. They were average members of society by day, but at night, they gathered at the bookshop to read magazines and books depicting the sexual abuse of boys, or watch films portraying the act. So this was a group of pedophiles that was meeting at this bookstore to read through child porn together and watch child porn together projected on a screen. And as the group grew, they began meeting at Darren's, the lawyer's home on the edge of the city of Adelaide. In the mid-1970s, the group came to include important members of Adelaide's society, and they all had mostly flown under the radar. You see, until the year 1975, and this is pretty crazy, consensual sex between adult males had been illegal, but the group had begun to catch the eye of the local police. When 1975 came, many adult men began to celebrate their freedom by being more outgoing about their true identity. But for the family, It meant finally operating on their sick interests. The family began to access boys for the purpose of sexual abuse, targeting those who were troubled or caught up in the wrong side of the law. They were seen as easy prey, with most being runaways or wards of the state. During this time, people who were part of this group began entering positions of power in the judiciary system, such as a lawyer by the name of Peter Liddy. Peter Liddy was appointed the youngest ever magistrate or judge in South Australia in the year 1974, at the young age of 29. However, 28 years later, the same Peter Liddy, the same man who broke records and was supposed to uphold and fight for justice, would be arrested for the sexual abuse of young boys. It's widely considered that Peter Liddy obtained this position in the government, that he was given this high-ranking, powerful position because of the influence of the family. In the early months of 1979, you see, the family was already a group of men who remained unknown, protected by legal and social standing. Many of the members of this group, all whom were violent, vile pedophiles, though mostly unnamed, were thought to be in the high positions of power within the city. People thought they were your mayors, your politicians, your celebrities, your people who were on the news, your familiar faces. In the daylight, they were supposedly protecting the city and working for the people. And that night, behind closed doors in these houses and apartments, they were raping and murdering and sometimes mutilating young boys. Disturbingly, these powerful men had easy access to boys whom they could abuse, and Darren Stevenson had become central to the group until June 4th, 1979. On that day, Darren, the lawyer, was murdered. He had been shot in the back of the head by a .22 rimfire round from a Ruger rifle. His death was speculated to be caused by his involvement with the family. He had received a phone call, in fact, earlier that day, and was later noted as sobbing, "I want out," over and over again. And this murder didn't seem to be random. In fact, the rifle used was Darren's own rifle. Whoever had killed him was no threat, it seemed, and they had walked into his office, taken the gun, and shot him execution style. He seemed to have been killed by someone he knew, someone he trusted. His body was then placed in his own freezer, and after the body was discovered, many more disturbing things came to light about the sexual predator. You see, Darren, before his death, would take payment for his legal services using many different methods, including jewelry, precious stones, drugs, and most horrifically, young boys. Yeah, when clients couldn't pay Darren for their legal services with cash or checks or money orders, you heard that correctly, he would take payment in the form of raping young children. Darren's murder became known under the title of The Body in the Freezer, and is one of the larger cases associated with the family to this day. That is because Darren was an original kind of member of the family. He was shot by somebody in the family in the back of the head to protect only God knows what. Two of the people who were questioned in the murder of Darren were David Shack, Darren's 19-year-old long-term boyfriend, which obviously you can infer from the words long-term means that Darren had been dating David since he was a minor, and 33-year-old chiropractor Gino Gambardella. Darren Stevenson, the attorney who was murdered, had represented Gambardella before in court, where he was being charged with offenses against young male children. Gino, the chiropractor, had been charged 3 times by 1968, and in 1979, he was charged again with raping children. Gino was considered to be a scout in the family, and was often tasked with procuring young men and boys for the group. In fact, Gino Gambardella had brought David and Darren's together, when in 1976, Gino brought David Shack to Darren's home. David, through a testimony by Gino, was found guilty of Darren's murder and eventually sentenced to prison. Now, Gino Gambardella, on the other hand, was not further prosecuted. Even with the assault charges pending against him, Gino took his children and fled to Italy in 1980, leaving behind his wife and the family home. Because of this incident, the family nearly crumbled. Gino, the chiropractor, the rapist of young children, the pedophile, was a key to their operation. And apparently something upset Darren, the lawyer, so greatly that he at the time wanted to get out. It seemed that he had seen something so truly monstrous, something so horrible and despicable, that even he, a veteran pedophile for decades, couldn't stomach. Like, that's hardcore. Darren was already pretty much a founding member of this group and was a hardcore pedophile himself who had taken part in all this child pornography and rape and abduction of young boys. But Darren had seen something so truly terrible he could not stand it, and he wanted to get out. He was crying. But what was this that he had seen? Well, rumors started that Darrence had been asked to supply his much younger lover, David, to star in a violent rape porn torture film. But whatever the case was, he was killed for his denial to participate. This murder, this message that there was no option to deny the family what they wanted, caused many of the members to lay low for quite some time. One member that didn't slow down, however, was Bevan von Einem, an associate of Darrence Stevenson, the murdered lawyer. Bevan von Einem had become friends with high-profile members of the family through shared interests. In this case, the sick satisfaction they all gained from watching films of young boys being beaten, raped, and sometimes murdered on camera. It's alleged that many members of the family, the high-ranking social elite, had aided Bevan von Einem in his crimes against young men and boys, but it was also said that many more boys that went missing were also victims of the family, used for snuff films, and then discarded. A theory regarding Bevan's killings is that he used his victims to create snuff films for the family. So if you don't know what a snuff film, it's a film where somebody is murdered, like actually murdered on camera. And there are some really truly sick, twisted people out there that get off on this shit. If you look it up online, it's kind of insane. There are people that say, oh, there's no proof that a snuff film has ever been produced in real life. There's no proof there's ever been a snuff film made. Shut the up. There are thousands of snuff films that have been proved to have been produced. So I don't know why there is this myth online that snuff films themselves are a myth, because they do in fact exist. And just like with North Fox Island and the Oakland County child killings, there you go. There are these allegations, family members to this day that believe that those kids were murdered on film to be sold. Here you go again with the snuff films and the family. What seems to happen is that these pedophile rings start off raping children. Then they group together and they decide they want to rape kids together. Then some people start making money from these rapes, or they really enjoy these rapes. And as time goes on, some of the clients or the people involved in these pedophile rings start to say, raping a child just isn't enough. What would I really like to do? Well, nowadays, I would really like to torture a child. Then the torture turns to, man, I'd really like to rape, torture, and murder this child. And there are pedophiles out there that, want to see that sick shit. And that's why these snuff films, slowly you see in time, especially in the 70s and 80s, start to be produced by these groups. So the family, though, back to the family, they somehow went untouched throughout the process of all of these investigations, with authorities failing to properly investigate or interview these high-level people, these doctors, these politicians, and judges that were supposedly involved. The reasonings were less than convincing, normally being called unreliable tips, and sometimes there was no reason at all for failing to investigate these accused people. And when some of these people were finally brought up on charges, their charges seemed to disappear as if by magic, or more likely, through influence. So, were the family murders deliberately unsolved, or were people ordered to stay quiet? Now, one could argue that Bevan von Einem acted alone, but there are clues that the family was involved. You see, before Alan's death, he had charges brought against him. It said that he engaged the services of none other than von Einem's associate, Darrence Stevenson, to help defend himself. He was also accused of dabbling in recreational drugs that he may have purchased from Bevan von Einem. Not only this, but accusations have been made that Darko Castellan, the boy that Alan met shortly before his death, had been seen with Gino Gambardella, that pedophile, and that the two had been trying to lure in a 15-year-old boy to take part in a sexual encounter with them. Darrence, the lawyer, was also certainly involved in the family, and Bevan von Einem was said to be one of his closest associates. There's more than enough evidence between these connections to believe that von Einem committed these murders, but he wasn't alone. He had help 100%. Back to Mr. B. This guy, still, we don't know who the hell Mr. B is. Mr. B is walking out in Adelaide in Australia to this day a free man. And he named many of these associates and gave great detail on their and murder and torture of these young boys. But none of them were ever even charged with these crimes. At every turn, when you look into this story, just like so many other stories, luck seems to favor the family, or something darker than luck, social influence and death threats. You see, Darrence, that lawyer, had been killed for trying to leave the family. He'd been shot in the back of the head and stuffed into a freezer. Perhaps the family was kept together through these sorts of threats. As Dennis St. Dennis told Trevor, you'll keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you. To make matters even more concerning, Bevan von Einem was not only accused of the 5 murders throughout the late 70s and early 80s. Mr. B's testimony implicated Bevan von Einem in numerous crimes. Actually, crimes involved in the disappearances or murders of up to 150 missing and murdered young men and children. Pedophile crimes. These people were implicated in the murders, abductions, disappearances of up to 150 minors. I believe they're all minors. They could be, up to age 18. I don't really know the age of consent in Australia, but they're all young. Mr. B implicated Bevan in the Adelaide Oval kidnappings when 2 young girls were kidnapped from an Australian rules football match at the Adelaide Oval. He was also implicated in the abduction of the Beaumont children when 3 young siblings disappeared from Glenelg Beach near Adelaide. Bevan von Einem, if you don't know this by now, is truly a fucking monster. And even in his many years of incarceration, his ways have never seemed to have changed. You see, Debbie Marshall, a true crime author, visited the murderer von Einem in Port Augusta prison, where he had been transferred from Yatala labor prison in 2007. At Yatala, Bevan von Einem had been investigated for allegedly raping an inmate several times. He'd also been accused of writing several fictitious stories about acts between a child and a man, though the handwriting and fingerprints were later said not to match. I don't buy it. Bull. I think he definitely wrote that sick shit. Bevan was then placed in high security at Port Augusta, just as he had been at the Yatala prison. Frighteningly mirroring Mr. B's testimony, around August of 2007, a 7 News Network archive asked for information about a man seen near a storm drain that the police were investigating concerning the disappearance of those Beaumont children we just mentioned. And the man in the news film bore a striking, frightening resemblance to Bevan von Einem in his youth. This was the man that Debbie Marshall had come to see, and he had not lost any of his horrific demeanor when she sat down in front of him. Debbie stated that she felt like Clarice in Silence of the Lambs, sitting in front of murderer and cannibal Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Guards with guns stood in the room as she and the criminal began to speak. She was the first visitor in 7 years, and perhaps to garner sympathy, Bevan first talks about his abusive father and the sexual abuse he faced at the hands of his father's friend. Now that's tragic, and obviously rape and molestation is never excusable. But at that point, Debbie only cared about these murder cases and abductions and rapes that Bevan had committed. She asked about the wealthy businessman who has still remained unnamed and how involved he was with the family. Now, in this interview, Bevan von Einem says he hasn't seen the businessman in many years and that he didn't know anything about the family because it didn't exist. According to Bevan von Einem, the family doesn't exist. Now, while Bevan von Einem had been in prison, he had allegedly confessed to a fellow inmate that he had been the one responsible for the missing Beaumont children. Bevan von Einem denies this accusation, though, once again when Debbie presses him for an answer. Their time was limited to speak to each other, and after this, Debbie left. Bevan von Einem had been charming and kind on the first visit, yet the next day when Debbie returned, he began to show his true colors. Debbie Marshall asked him blatantly about Richard Kelvin, and the man's demeanor suddenly changed. He was no longer charming or kind. He was now revealing a psychopath who was no stranger to murder. Bevan became unsettled and stated coldly to Debbie. Everyone painted him as this straight boy, but he wasn't. His father was in the media and they wanted to get the message out that he was straight. Bevan, for many years, still denied killing Richard. From the time he had pleaded not guilty, he had maintained that innocence. Yet, Debbie's next question all but proved his guilt. You see, Debbie asked if Richard was wearing the dog collar when Bevan saw him. He admitted, yes, he was. The detectives in Adelaide could never get this admission out of him, and it meant that he had been stalking Richard for some time before he was kidnapped. Richard, you see, had removed the dog collar at the bus stop where he and his friend parted ways after playing football. Bevan initially stated that he had almost run over Richard as he was walking home. But Richard wouldn't have been wearing the dog collar if Bevan's story was true. The admission also meant that Bevan had put the collar back on the boy after seeing him wearing it. It reveals the truly sadistic nature of von Einem as he stalked young Richard and put the collar back around his neck specifically for the torture and murder of the young boy. It shows that after all these years, as this man is in his 70s and his health is degrading, he's finally starting to slip and tell some truth about the story. Perhaps as the years go on, more will come out in the search for truth. Bevan may reveal his secrets and perhaps reveal the names of those who helped him carry out these pedophile crimes, finally opening the door to reveal the horrific, deep, dark world of Adelaide's family. I mean, this is a pedophile ring that reaches all the way up through the politicians of the day, through the celebrities of the day, the judges of the day who were deciding the fates of other criminals. This reaches to doctors who were treating, I'm assuming, children in their clinics who people trusted with their health. And only God knows how far this stretches. I mean, these people sure as aren't gonna squeal on the real high top players, the people who were really at the top of this organization. Von Einem is almost like a low cog in the machine, if you want to think of it like that. He's running these crimes, he's doing this shit, he's procuring these boys, he's still raping and enjoying these rapes. But who is he really working for? And who were the people that were stopping by this apartment or this house and raping boys, or even appearing on camera in these child films and these snuff films? I mean, it's sickening shit. Sickening shit. But perhaps, maybe soon in the future, Von Einem will admit to more of the crimes he carried out. The crimes that Mr. B stated Von Einem committed. Or perhaps new information will come from other sources, such as Trevor's diary, which still hasn't been fully explored. Now that many of the suspects and implicated names have passed away, people such as Gino Gambardella, the pedophile, Sarah Novak, the victim turned accomplice, and Prue Furman, the rapist, many of the opportunities for the truth have been lost. The best that can be hoped for is that someone realizes the horrors of their actions, the depravity of the organization that they were involved with, this pedophile ring, and the pain that their secrecy has caused. All they have to do is come forward and allow justice to take place. The city of Adelaide, now known as the City of Corpses, has indeed earned its name. Kidnappings, murders, and many crimes against children filled the police files there. You see, Adelaide was said in its 1982 promotional video to have that feeling. That feeling was said to be gentle and kind. But according to the story of the family murders, that feeling is one of dread, utter terror, suspicion, and fear. Among the people of South Australia, murderers and pedophiles walk freely, protected by their own status. People still look over their shoulders, protecting their children and loved ones from being the next body found. The family should be a word dedicated to a group of people who share kindness and love amongst each other. It should be a comforting name, a title given to those who are nurturing and compassionate. But in Adelaide, South Australia, the words mean anything but. You see, in South Australia, the family is dedicated to death, horror, conspiracy, and injustice. Holy y'all, that was a long one. Oh my God. I hope you guys enjoyed that really deep dive. Thank you to Sabrin for writing that script. And just think about the implications. This isn't a true crime podcast meant to just tell these stories. This needs to wake people the up. Think about those implications. There are a group of people in the government, people in the highest rankings of Australia, politicians, lawyers, everyday people, doctors, prominent people. And those are just the people we know about from one guy who leaked, who knows how far out that stretched. And those people were never tried, charged, convicted of a single child, when not only were these 5 boys and murdered, mutilated and tortured and held hostage for days too, when these groups of men would come through to where they were being held and rape them. But these pedophiles were raping and murdering kids all over the country. It could be as many as 150 victims. And that's a lot of pedophiles. And they were probably filming all of this shit, sharing all of this shit, and could have been selling this shit. And who knows where the this shit ended up. It could be going to America, it'd be going to Asia, it could be going to South America to pedophile groups all over. And only one guy is brought down for this. None of even the other accomplices, just one guy. And even that one sick bastard won't even admit that the family is real. That's a lot of food for thought, but please share this video out. Help me to raise some awareness about these despicable crimes. Hopefully so much awareness can eventually be raised through this show and constantly talking about this stuff that some more investigations can be open and the public can pressure the people making the laws or, performing the investigations in Australia to reopen this shit. But anyways, guys, make sure to leave me a like, comment, your thoughts on this case in the comment section if you're watching on YouTube. Be sure to leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you all for listening to this very long episode. We will be back next week, next Wednesday, with another episode of the Conspiracy Files. Keep that tin hat on. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch y'all on the next one.